The night Hannah Mercer was thrown out of her home, her 4-year-old daughter asked a question that broke her mother's heart. "Mommy, where are we going to sleep?" Hannah had no answer. She was standing barefoot in the snow outside the house she had lived in for 6 years, holding her daughter against her chest while her 7-year-old son stood beside her without a coat. Inside the warm house, her brother-in-law was already turning off the lights. Then he opened the door one last time. "You should have taken the money," he said. Hannah stared at him through the falling snow. "What money?" "The $25,000 settlement your father's estate offered you." "That wasn't my inheritance." Daniel smiled coldly. "No, Hannah. Your inheritance is a cemetery." He shut the door. Hannah stood there in silence. Her father had died only 3 weeks earlier, leaving her a property nobody in the family wanted: 4 acres of frozen ground, an abandoned caretaker's house, and an old graveyard containing generations of Mercer family graves. The county had assessed everything at just $7,400. Her brother-in-law called it worthless. The relatives called it a burden. And that night, with 46.82 pounds in her purse and nowhere to take her children, Hannah was beginning to believe them. Until she remembered one thing her father had said 6 months before his death. "If they ever tell you that what I left you is worthless, don't sign anything." At the time, she had laughed. Now she wished she had asked what he meant. Because as the snow thickened and her children began shivering in the back seat, Hannah made a decision that would change the entire family. She drove 11 miles beyond the last gas station, past the abandoned church, past the broken wooden bridge, until she reached a rusted iron gate standing in the middle of the wilderness. Beyond it was the cemetery, and the cemetery stood her inheritance. A small, black-roofed house surrounded by hundreds of graves. No electricity, no heat, no neighbors, no reason anyone would willingly spend a night there. But Hannah had run out of choices. She carried her children through the gate. She unlocked the door. And before sunrise, while trying to find a safe place for them to sleep, she noticed something beneath the kitchen floor. One floorboard was newer than all the others. Someone had replaced it recently, and nailed beneath it, almost completely hidden in the wood, was a single word written in her father's handwriting. "Wait." Quick question before we continue. What city are you listening from tonight? Tell us in the comments. 6 months before that January night, Hannah had still believed her life was ordinary. Not easy, just ordinary. She worked the morning shift at a nursing home in Charleston, West Virginia, earning $17.40 an hour. Her husband, Mark, had left 2 years earlier after quietly draining their joint savings and disappearing with a woman he worked with. He never fought Hannah for the children. He simply stopped coming home. The divorce became final in October. By then, Hannah had learned how quickly a normal life could become a collection of unpaid bills. Her rent was $1,145 a month. The electric bill had reached $300. Her car needed 2 new tires, and Caleb had outgrown his winter boots. Hannah kept postponing everything she could. She bought groceries with coupons. She skipped lunch at work. When Lily developed an ear infection in November, Hannah put the $186 doctor's bill on a payment plan. She never told the children how worried she was. Then, in December, her father called. Thomas Hale had always been a quiet man. He repaired farm machinery for most of his life and rarely spoke about money, even when people knew he had once owned considerable land. That evening, his voice sounded different. Tired, Hannah remembered thinking. "Come see me Saturday," he had said. "Dad, I work." "Then come after." "Is something wrong?" There was a pause. "No, I just need to give you something." Hannah drove to his house 2 days later. Her father handed her an old brass key. It was blackened with age. "What does this open?" "The house." "What house?" The one your grandfather left behind. Hannah laughed. She thought he was joking. Thomas didn't smile. You've heard of Mercy Hill? Yes? The cemetery? The house inside it. Hannah stared at him. Dad, nobody lives there. They used to. Why would you leave that to me? Her father looked toward the window. Because you're the only one I trust. She remembered those words now. At the time, they had frightened her more than they comforted her. Before she left, Thomas placed a sealed envelope in her hand. Don't open it until you need to. What am I going to need? He looked directly at her. To know who was telling you the truth. 3 weeks later, he was dead. A heart attack. No warning. No final conversation. At the funeral, Daniel was the one who handled most of the paperwork. He told Hannah her father had left almost nothing. Then came the settlement offer. $25,000. Daniel said it was generous. Hannah refused. Something about the offer bothered her. Her father's estate attorney had never mentioned it. 2 days later, Daniel stopped answering her calls. Then the eviction notice arrived. By the time Hannah reached the cemetery that freezing night, she finally understood why her father had insisted she keep the brass key. She unlocked the abandoned house. Her children fell asleep wrapped in old blankets beside the dead fireplace. Hannah sat awake until nearly 3 a.m. Then she remembered the sealed envelope. She pulled it from her coat pocket. The paper was yellowed. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. There were only 6 words on the front. When you have nowhere else to go. Hannah slowly broke the seal. Hannah didn't open the letter immediately. She held it in both hands, staring at her father's handwriting while the wind pressed against the windows. There was something about that envelope that made her hesitate. Instead, she tucked it back into her coat. Her children were sleeping. For tonight, that was enough. At first light, Hannah stepped outside. The cemetery looked different in daylight. It stretched across a shallow hillside, crowded with weathered stones from the 1800s and early 1900s. Some leaned sideways, others had disappeared beneath weeds and moss. The caretaker's house sat near the center. It was smaller than Hannah remembered from childhood. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a porch that sagged toward the cemetery. The roof had survived. Barely. One window was broken. The kitchen sink had rusted through. The old furnace had no chance of working. But the walls were solid. For the first time in weeks, Hannah had something that felt dangerously close to shelter. She spent the morning clearing glass from the kitchen floor while Caleb carried pieces of firewood from the porch. Lily stayed close to her mother. Are the dead people outside? She asked. Hannah looked through the window. Yes. Can they come inside? No. How do you know? Hannah smiled faintly. Because they have their own homes. That afternoon, an old pickup stopped beside the gate. A man climbed out slowly. He was around 70, wearing brown work pants, suspenders, and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. My name's Earl Whitaker, he said. Hannah recognized him from her father's funeral. You knew my dad. Knew him 43 years. Earl looked at the house, then at the cemetery. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of his front tooth, a habit Hannah noticed immediately. Didn't think anyone would come back. Here. My father left it to me. I heard. Earl nodded. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Hannah asked, Why did everyone act like this place was worthless? Earl looked toward the graves. Because that's what Thomas wanted them to think. Hannah's stomach tightened. What does that mean? Earl shook his head. Means your father was a private man. That isn't an answer. No. He glanced toward the house. But it's the safest answer I can give you. Before leaving, Earl walked to the cemetery's oldest section. He stopped beside a large stone bearing the name Samuel Hale, 1891 to 1963. He used to visit this grave every Sunday, Earl said. Who? Your grandfather. Hannah frowned. My grandfather died before I was born. I know. Earl looked back at her. Your father wasn't visiting his father. He pointed toward a second gravestone behind it. The name had been almost erased by time. Martha Hale. Your father came here for her. Hannah stared at the stone. Who was Martha? Earl's expression changed. That's the trouble. He climbed into his truck. You should ask your father. Then he drove away. Hannah stood alone among the graves. Her father was dead. The man who could answer her was gone. But as she returned to the house, she noticed something that stopped her at the porch. The front door had been locked when she left that morning. Now it was slightly open. Hannah stopped 3 steps from the porch. She hadn't left the door open. She was certain of it. The wind pushed gently against the screen, making the hinges creak. Caleb? She called. No answer. Lily? Silence. She hurried inside. The children were exactly where she'd left them, sitting on the living room floor with a deck of faded cards they'd found in an old cabinet. Hannah exhaled. Mom, look. Caleb held up a card. The Queen. That's nice, sweetheart. He looked at her face. What happened? Nothing. She forced a smile, but she didn't believe it. Someone had been inside. She checked every room, the bedrooms, the bathroom, the kitchen. Nothing appeared missing. The windows were still locked. There were no footprints on the dusty floor except their own. Then she noticed the fireplace. A small pile of ash had shifted. Not much, just enough to expose a dark metal object beneath it. Hannah crouched and pulled it free. A horseshoe nail, old and heavily rusted. She turned it between her fingers. Her father had once told her that old farmers used horseshoe nails for all kinds of repairs. She nearly threw it away. Then she noticed something carved into its flat side. A tiny triangle. Inside the triangle was a single horizontal line. Hannah remembered seeing the same mark years earlier. On the brass key. Her heart began beating faster. She went back into the kitchen. The floorboards were uneven. One section near the stove looked newer than the rest. She knelt and pressed her fingertips along the wood. One board moved. She froze. Mom? Stay in the living room. She found an old butter knife and worked it beneath the edge. The board lifted with a dry crack. Underneath was darkness, not dirt. A narrow wooden frame. Hannah scraped away dust. There was a metal ring attached to something below. A trap door. She stared at it for nearly a minute. Then Caleb appeared behind her. What is that? Nothing. It doesn't look like nothing. Hannah almost laughed. Children had a way of saying exactly what adults tried to avoid. She lowered the board back into place. That night, after the children fell asleep, she returned with a flashlight. The trap door was real. So was the metal ring. But she couldn't pull it open. Something underneath held it shut. She searched the kitchen cabinets until she found an old iron poker. Using it as leverage, she lifted the trap door an inch. Cold air rose from below. Not the damp smell of soil. Something older. Dry wood. Dust. And, faintly, the smell of metal. Hannah's flashlight beam disappeared into a narrow opening. There was a ladder. Someone had built a room beneath the house. She climbed down 2 steps, then stopped. On the wall was the same triangle symbol. Beneath it, someone had scratched 4 words into the wood. Wait until they come. Hannah's mouth went dry. They. Not him. Not her. Them. She climbed back upstairs and locked the trapdoor. Then she remembered the envelope in her coat, the one her father had told her not to open until she had nowhere else to go. She finally understood. This was exactly why he had written those words. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the letter, and began to read. The letter began without a greeting. "Hannah, if you are reading this, then something has gone badly wrong." She stopped. Her father's handwriting looked different on paper than it had in life. Slower, more deliberate. She continued, "I know you will think I am being dramatic. You always did. You were the one who laughed when I told you to keep copies of important papers. You said nobody in our family had anything worth stealing." I wish that were true. Hannah looked toward the kitchen doorway. The house was silent. She read on. "The property I left you is not worth $7,400. It never was." Hannah's fingers tightened around the paper. There were several lines scratched out beneath that sentence. Then, "I cannot explain everything in this letter. If I do, there will be nothing left for you to discover, and more importantly, there will be a record someone can use against you. But remember this. The cemetery was never the secret. The house was." Hannah looked toward the trapdoor. Her breathing slowed. She kept reading. "Years ago, your grandfather discovered that several parcels of land surrounding Mercy Hill had been transferred out of the family without proper authorization. The original records were never filed correctly. Someone altered them. I found evidence of it after your grandfather died. I spent 26 years trying to understand what happened. Then I learned something worse. The people who benefited from those transfers knew exactly what they had done." Hannah lowered the letter. Her first thought was Daniel. Then she rejected it. Daniel wasn't old enough. This had happened generations earlier. She continued, "If someone offers you money for the property, do not accept it until you know why, especially if the offer comes from family." The final paragraph was shorter. "Hannah, I am sorry I waited so long to tell you. I believed keeping you away from this place would keep you safe. I was wrong. Your mother would have wanted you to know the truth." Hannah stared at that sentence. Her mother had died when Hannah was 9. She had almost no memories of her. Then she noticed something written at the bottom of the page. A separate line. In darker ink. "The first key is already in the house." Hannah read it twice. Then she heard something outside. A vehicle. Headlights swept across the kitchen wall. Someone had stopped at the cemetery gate. Hannah quickly folded the letter. She turned off the lamp. The vehicle remained there. No horn, no footsteps, just the engine idling in the darkness. Then the headlights went out. Hannah stood behind the curtain, watching the black shape through a gap in the fabric. She couldn't see the driver, but she knew one thing now. Someone else knew the house wasn't worthless, and whoever had come to the cemetery that night hadn't come to check on her. Hannah didn't sleep much that night. The vehicle remained at the cemetery gate for almost 20 minutes. Then it left. She waited another 10 before moving away from the window. At 5:40 in the morning, she heard an engine again. This time it was Earl Whitaker. He climbed out carrying 2 paper grocery bags. "I brought bread," he said. Hannah opened the door only halfway. "Did you come here last night?" Earl stopped. His eyes moved toward the cemetery. "No. Someone did." He scratched his jaw. "Could have been anybody." "You don't believe that?" Earl sighed. "No." That was the first time Hannah saw fear in his face. She stepped aside. Earl entered and placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. "You find anything?" Hannah studied him. "What makes you ask that?" He looked at the floor. "Thomas told me you might." "About the house?" "About the possibility." "What possibility?" Earl pulled out a chair. Instead of sitting, he turned it around and rested his arms across the back. "Your father was looking for something." "What?" "I never knew exactly." "You're lying." Earl looked offended. "I've known you since you were 12. And you're still lying." He gave a tired half smile. "Fair enough." He finally sat. Thomas believed somebody had hidden the original land records beneath the house. Hannah's stomach tightened. Why? Because the records disappeared in 1947. What records? Property transfers, deeds, mineral rights, old survey maps. Hannah remembered her father's letter. How much land? Earl hesitated. More than 4 acres. How much more? Nearly 1,900. Hannah stared at him. The house suddenly felt much smaller. Earl continued. Most of it was sold off over the years. Timber companies, coal interests, private owners. But Thomas believed some of those sales weren't legal. Then why didn't he go to court? Because he'd need proof. Hannah looked toward the kitchen floor. The room beneath the house. Earl's expression changed. You found it. It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded. Earl stood immediately. You shouldn't go down there alone. Why? Because if Thomas was right, somebody may have spent 70 years making sure nobody found what he was looking for. Before Hannah could respond, tires crunched over the gravel. Earl looked toward the window. A black SUV had stopped outside. A man in a grey wool coat stepped out. Hannah recognized him. Daniel. He walked toward the house carrying a leather folder. Earl whispered, "Don't let him inside." Daniel knocked. "Hannah?" She didn't answer. "I know you're in there." The knock came again. Then Daniel spoke through the door. "I brought you a better offer." Hannah looked at Earl. He shook his head. Daniel slid an envelope beneath the door. $41,000. Hannah stared at it. Her entire body went still. $41,000 could change her children's lives. But Daniel had driven 11 miles through a snowstorm to offer it for a property he had called worthless. That was when Hannah understood. He wasn't buying a house. He was buying whatever was underneath it. Hannah stared at the envelope on the floor. $41,000. The number was almost impossible to ignore. Her car loan was $6,800. She owed $2,900 in back rent and late fees. The children's school had sent home a notice about unpaid lunch accounts, and sitting inside that envelope was enough money to start over somewhere warm, somewhere normal. Daniel knocked again. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "You just have to understand what this property is going to cost you." Hannah didn't answer. He continued. "There's a developer interested in the surrounding land. They've already spent money on surveys. If you don't sell, you're going to end up fighting people who have attorneys." Earl leaned close to Hannah. "Don't sign anything." Daniel heard him. "Earl, you should stay out of family business." Earl gave a dry laugh. "Been hearing that sentence since 1978. Daniel ignored him. "Hannah, the offer is good for 48 hours. "Why?" "Because I have investors waiting." "Why do they want a cemetery?" "They don't." That answer came too quickly. Hannah noticed. Daniel corrected himself. "They want the acreage around it." "Then why do you need my 4 acres?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Access." "Access to what?" Silence. For the first time, Hannah saw uncertainty cross his face. Then he said, "The old survey is wrong." She felt a chill. "You know about the survey?" Daniel recovered quickly. "Everybody knows about it." "No, they don't." He stared at her. Hannah picked up the envelope. Daniel smiled. "You're making the smart decision." She opened it. Inside was a cashier's check for $41,000. Her name was printed on it. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe. Then she folded the check back into the envelope. "No." Daniel's smile disappeared. "You're turning down $41,000. "Yes." "For that?" He pointed toward the cemetery. "You have 2 children sleeping in a house without heat." Hannah's voice remained quiet. "You're right." Daniel looked confused. "I do." She held the envelope toward him. "Which means, if you're offering me $41,000 for this place, it isn't worth $41,000. Daniel didn't take the envelope. His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're doing." "Maybe not." She closed the door. The moment the latch clicked, Earl let out a breath. "That was stupid." Hannah looked at him. "I know." "No, I mean refusing him." "I know what you mean." Earl lowered his voice. You just made yourself interesting. That evening, Hannah went downstairs alone. She took the flashlight and examined the walls beneath the kitchen. The triangle symbol appeared 3 more times. Then she noticed something behind a loose stone. A narrow metal box. Inside was a folded survey map. The paper was brittle, but the ink was surprisingly clear. A red line surrounded nearly 2,000 acres. Across the center, someone had written, "Not sold." Hannah unfolded the map completely. The 4 acres she had inherited were marked with a black triangle, but the triangle wasn't centered on the house. It pointed directly toward the cemetery, and beneath the cemetery was another handwritten note. Entry is not below the house. Hannah stared at those words. Then she heard a noise above her. A floorboard creaked. Someone was walking inside the house. She turned off the flashlight. A second step followed, then a third. Whoever had entered hadn't come through the front door. Hannah stayed completely still. The footsteps above her stopped. For a few seconds, she heard nothing except the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock. Then, a cabinet opened. Someone was searching the house. She gripped the flashlight like a weapon. The basement had only one exit, and it led directly into the kitchen. There was nowhere else to go. Another cabinet slammed shut. Then she heard Caleb. "Mom?" Her heart dropped. The footsteps stopped. Hannah climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Caleb was standing in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "What's happening?" "Get your sister. But now." He ran toward the bedroom. Hannah entered the kitchen. The back door was open. Cold air poured inside. The intruder was gone. On the counter, however, lay the letter from her father. Hannah had left it upstairs earlier. Now it had been unfolded. Someone had read it. Her hands began to shake. She checked the children's room. Both were there, safe. She locked every door. Then she called Earl. He arrived 15 minutes later carrying a flashlight and an old hunting rifle. Hannah noticed the rifle immediately. "You came prepared. I've lived around here too long to come unprepared." He inspected the door. No broken lock, no damaged frame. Then he looked at the snow outside. There were footprints leading away from the back porch. Earl crouched. Man's wearing work boots. "Can you tell who?" "No." He followed the tracks toward the cemetery. They stopped beside a large stone. Earl looked at the name. Samuel Hale. He shook his head. "That's not good." "Why?" "Because Thomas used to hide things around this grave." Hannah stared at him. "What things?" Earl looked uncomfortable. "Questions." "That isn't funny." "No." He pointed toward the ground. "Look." Near the gravestone was a shallow depression in the snow. Someone had been digging. Hannah knelt. The soil beneath the snow was freshly disturbed. She brushed it aside and found a small brass key. Her father's initials were engraved on it. T.H. Earl went pale. "I haven't seen that key in 20 years. "You knew about it?" "I knew there was a key." "To what?" Earl stood slowly. "I never found out." Hannah turned it over. On the back was the same triangle symbol. She looked toward the house, then toward the cemetery. "The entry isn't below the house," she said. Earl nodded. "Your map." Hannah unfolded it. The black triangle marking her property pointed toward Samuel Hale's grave. Earl studied the map. Then he looked at Hannah. "Your father wasn't hiding something under the house." "Then where?" Earl walked toward the grave. He stopped 3 feet from the headstone. "Underneath this." Hannah's pulse quickened. But this is a grave. Earl's expression hardened. Maybe that's exactly why nobody ever looked. He brushed snow from the stone. Behind it, almost invisible beneath the moss, was another triangle. But this one had something beneath it. 3 tiny numbers. 1763. Hannah recognized the date immediately. April 17th, 1963. The day her grandfather had died. She looked at Earl. What happened that day? Earl didn't answer. He simply stared at the grave. Then, quietly, he said, Your grandfather wasn't buried here. Hannah looked at the headstone again. Samuel Hale, 1891 to 1963. Her grandfather's name. His grave. Except Earl had just told her he wasn't buried there. Then whose grave is this? Earl didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his front tooth, the same nervous habit Hannah had noticed when they first met. That's what your father spent years trying to find out. Hannah stared at him. You knew. I knew something was wrong. You let me believe my grandfather was buried here. You were 9 when your father brought you to the funeral. What was I supposed to tell you? The truth. Earl sighed. Sometimes the truth gets people hurt. Hannah looked toward the house. People are already trying to hurt me. That ended the argument. Earl pulled a small shovel from the bed of his truck. They waited until the children were asleep before returning to the cemetery. Snow covered everything again. Under the beam of Earl's flashlight, the grave looked ordinary, too ordinary. Hannah pushed the shovel into the ground near the headstone. The soil was frozen. After 20 minutes, they uncovered a flat concrete slab. There was no coffin, no remains, just a rectangular metal plate. Hannah brushed away the dirt. The plate had a keyhole. Her brass key fit perfectly. She looked at Earl. He nodded. Hannah turned it. A metallic click sounded beneath them. The slab shifted slightly. Cold air rose from the opening. A narrow stairway descended into darkness. Hannah's first instinct was to call the police. Her second was to close everything and leave. Then she thought of Daniel's $41,000 check. The envelope. The altered records. Her father's warning. She took the flashlight. Earl caught her arm. You don't have to do this tonight. Yes. Why? Because someone already knows we're looking. She stepped down. The stairs ended in a stone chamber. It wasn't a tomb. It was a vault. Shelves lined 3 walls. On them sat metal boxes, leather folders, rolled maps, and glass jars containing things Hannah couldn't identify. In the center stood a wooden table. On it was a ledger. Hannah opened it. The first page was dated 1947. The names of dozens of landowners followed. Beside each name were acres, prices, and signatures. She turned pages. Her breathing became shallow. Some transactions were legitimate, others were marked with a red X. At the bottom of one page was a notation. Transfer refused. Original owner did not sign. The original owner's name was Samuel Hale. Hannah turned another page. Then another. The same property appeared again and again. Almost 1,900 acres, timber rights, coal rights, water rights. And beside the final entry was a figure written in blue ink. Estimated present value, $4,800,000. Hannah sat down. $4.8 million. Her father hadn't left her a worthless cemetery. He had left her the evidence that someone had stolen an inheritance from her family. Then she noticed a locked wooden box beneath the ledger. A brass plate was attached to its lid. It carried her name. Hannah Mercer. She stared at it. Earl whispered, "Thomas must have known you'd find this." Hannah touched the lock. For the first time that night, she wasn't thinking about money. She was wondering why her father had waited until after his death to put her name on a box he had hidden beneath a grave. Hannah didn't open the box that night. She wanted to. Every instinct told her to find out what her father had hidden. But the brass lock looked newer than everything around it, and something about that bothered her. Thomas had prepared this. Not decades ago. Recently. He had known she would come here. He had known someone might follow. Earl studied the box. "Where's the key?" Hannah looked at the brass key in her palm. It opened the vault. Then maybe there's another. She ran her fingers beneath the table. Nothing. Around the shelves. Nothing. Finally, she noticed a shallow groove carved into the wooden table. It formed the same triangle. Inside it were 3 numbers, 1763. The date, again. Hannah looked at the ledger. April 17th, 1963. Her grandfather's supposed burial date. She opened the ledger to that entry. This time she noticed something she had missed. Beside Samuel Hale's name was a handwritten note. Body never recovered. Property records removed. Family told otherwise. Hannah felt sick. "Earl." He came closer. She pointed. His face tightened. "Thomas knew." "Knew what?" "That Samuel wasn't buried here." "Then where was he?" Earl stared at the words. "I don't know." Hannah looked around the vault. There had to be an answer. She searched the shelves. One box contained photographs, another held old tax receipts, a third contained newspaper clippings. Then she found a folded survey map dated 1946. She spread it across the table. The property lines were different from the modern county map. The Hale land stretched from Mercy Hill all the way to a river nearly 6 miles away. At the bottom was a notation. Mineral rights retained by Hale family. Hannah whispered, "They never sold it." Earl shook his head. "Not legally." She looked toward the locked box. "What's in there?" Earl didn't answer. "Earl," he finally said, "something Thomas didn't trust me with." That frightened her more than anything else. Before she could ask another question, they heard a metallic sound above them. The vault door. Someone had entered the cemetery. Hannah extinguished the flashlight. Earl pulled her behind the shelves. Footsteps crossed the stone floor overhead. Slow. Careful. Then came the sound of the metal plate being lifted. Someone had found the entrance. Hannah held her breath. A beam of light appeared at the top of the stairs. Someone descended. One step, then another. The person stopped halfway down. Hannah couldn't see the face, but she recognized the voice. Daniel. "I know you're down here." Earl's hand tightened around the rifle. Daniel continued. "You have no idea what your father left you." Hannah stayed silent. Daniel took another step. "I do." Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "Because I helped him hide it. For several seconds, nobody moved." Daniel stood halfway down the stone stairs. Earl raised the rifle. "Don't," Daniel said quietly. He wasn't looking at Earl. He was looking at Hannah. "I came alone." "That doesn't make you safe," Earl replied. Daniel took another step. "I don't want to hurt anyone." Hannah almost laughed. "You threw my children into the snow." Daniel's expression tightened. "I didn't know it would come to that." "You knew I had nowhere to go. I knew you were stubborn. And you knew about this place." Daniel looked around the vault. "Yes." The answer was so simple that Hannah almost missed its importance. How? Daniel hesitated. Your father told me. When? 2 years ago. Hannah stared at him. Why would my father tell you? Because he needed help. Earl's voice sharpened. What kind of help? Daniel ignored him. Thomas had been sick longer than he admitted. He knew he wouldn't have enough time to finish what he'd started. Hannah stepped forward. So you knew about the land records? I knew some of them. You knew the property wasn't worthless? Yes. Then why did you lie to me? Daniel looked away. Because I owed money. Hannah waited. How much? $75,000. The number hung in the vault. Daniel explained that he had borrowed the money from a regional developer after promising to secure an option on the Hale acreage. The developer planned to build a private industrial site near the river. Daniel had already spent $58,000 of the advance. If he failed to produce control of the property, he would have to repay everything personally. I thought the cemetery parcel was the last obstacle, he said. You thought you could pressure me into selling. Yes. And the $41,000 was what I could get approved. Hannah looked at him. You were going to keep the difference. Daniel didn't deny it. Earl shook his head. You've got yourself in a hole. I know. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. I thought I could fix it. Hannah looked at the locked box. What did my father ask you to hide? Daniel's eyes moved toward it. Not the box. What then? The original deed. Hannah's pulse quickened. Where is it? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. Then why are you here? Because Thomas left one final instruction. He reached into his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. He told me that if Hannah ever found the vault, I was supposed to give her this. Hannah didn't take it. What does it say? Daniel looked directly at her. Where Samuel Hale was really buried. He unfolded the paper. The name written at the top wasn't Samuel. It was Martha Hale. Hannah felt the room change. Her father had spent 26 years looking for the truth. And now she was beginning to understand that the first lie hadn't been about the land. It had been about a grave. The paper in Daniel's hand was almost black with age. Hannah took it. At the top was her father's handwriting. Martha Hale, Mercy Hill, 1947. Below it was a short list of names, dates, and property numbers. Hannah read it twice. Then she understood why her father had been so careful. Martha Hale wasn't simply a relative. She had been the last person in the family to legally control the entire Hale property. In 1947, Martha had refused to sell the land to a timber company. 3 weeks later, she disappeared. The family was told she had left West Virginia. But Thomas had eventually discovered something else. Martha had died on the property. Her death had never been properly recorded, and the grave marked with Samuel Hale's name had actually been created decades later to conceal the location of a second burial. Earl lowered his head. I should have told you. Hannah looked at him. You knew about Martha? I knew she disappeared. That's not the same thing. No. His voice softened. Your father never stopped asking questions. Hannah looked at the map. The original 1946 survey showed a small structure behind the cemetery. It wasn't the house. It was a stone storage building beside an old spring. The structure had disappeared from every later map. Hannah pointed. This. Daniel nodded. Thomas believed Martha hid the original deed there. And you helped him search? Yes. Did you find it? Daniel looked at the locked box. No. Hannah turned toward the box. Then she remembered the phrase carved beneath the kitchen floor. Wait until they come. Not him. They. She looked at Earl. Who are they? Earl didn't answer. Daniel did. The people who inherited the land after Martha disappeared. Hannah felt the pieces finally begin to connect. The fraudulent transfers, the missing records, the developer. Daniel's debt, her father's secrecy. Someone had spent decades keeping the Hale family from proving what belonged to them. Then Hannah noticed something inside the wooden box, a narrow gap beneath the lid. She slid the brass key into it. The lock clicked. Inside was no money, no jewelry, no bonds. There was only an old photograph, a sealed envelope, and a small silver ring. Hannah picked up the photograph. It showed a young woman standing beside the cemetery house. Martha. Beside her stood a little boy, Thomas. On the back, her father had written, "She trusted the wrong person. I spent my life trying to correct that." Hannah opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. Her father's handwriting covered both sides. The first sentence made her sit down. "Hannah, if you are reading this, then you have already discovered what I could never prove in court." She read the next line, then stopped. Her eyes filled with tears, because her father hadn't left her instructions. He had left her an apology. Hannah read the letter slowly. "My dearest Hannah, if you have reached this room, then I failed to protect you in the way I intended. I thought keeping this secret would keep you away from the people who wanted it. Instead, it only left you unprepared. Your grandfather Samuel did not die the way our family was told, and Martha did not abandon us. They were both caught in a lie created by people who believed our land was more valuable than our lives. I spent 26 years looking for the original deed. I found it. But I couldn't prove how it had been taken without exposing people who were still powerful enough to hurt you. So I hid the evidence here. Not because I wanted you to become rich. Because I wanted one person in this family to have the chance to put things right." Hannah stopped reading. Her tears fell onto the paper. The letter continued. "You may discover that the land is worth millions. You may also discover that money attracts people who never cared about you. Don't let that become the reason you fight. Fight because your children deserve to know that what belongs to them cannot be taken simply because someone thinks you are too weak to resist. And Hannah, there is something else you need to know. Your mother knew about Martha. She helped me search. She died believing we would eventually prove the truth. I never told you because I wanted you to remember her as your mother, not as another person destroyed by this family. The final paragraph was written more heavily. The original deed is not in the vault. It is where Martha put it. She trusted one person. Find the place where she was buried. Not the grave with her name. The other one. Then use the deed. Don't sell. Don't surrender. And don't let Daniel carry this burden for you. He made mistakes, but he was trying to repay a debt created by my silence." Hannah lowered the peptone letter. Daniel looked away. She understood then why her father had included his name. He hadn't forgiven Daniel. He had simply refused to reduce him to a villain. Hannah folded the letter carefully. Then she looked at Earl. "Where is Martha's real grave?" Earl stared at her. "I know where." They climbed the stairs before dawn. The cemetery was covered in fresh snow. Earl walked beyond the marked graves toward a cluster of bare trees. He stopped beside a stone that carried no name. Hannah brushed away the snow. Beneath it was a small silver ring embedded in the earth. The same design as the one in her father's box. She pulled it free. A hidden metal plate was underneath. On it were 3 words. Mercy Hill Spring. Hannah looked toward the distant woods. The old spring lay nearly half a mile beyond the cemetery. And beneath it, according to her father's letter, was the final document. The deed. The proof. The inheritance everyone had called worthless. Hannah looked back at the little house where her children were sleeping. For the first time since Daniel had shut that door on her, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was afraid of what the truth would cost, but she was ready to pay it.